The spring auction yard in Millerville buzzed with the usual mixture of desperation and opportunity that Clarence Mitchell had grown to despise over his 3 years as Territorial Magistrate. Dust kicked up from the trampling of boots and hooves, creating a haze that seemed to settle over everything like the moral ambiguity of the proceedings themselves. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching as families sold their possessions to survive another season. Clarence had seen enough auctions to know the difference between willing sellers and those forced by circumstance. The way a man's shoulders sagged when his plow went under the hammer. The tight line of a woman's mouth as her grandmother's china disappeared into strangers' hands. The careful way children pressed close to their mothers when strangers examined their families' belongings with calculating eyes. Today felt different, though. There was an undercurrent of something darker running through the crowd, whispers that stopped when he drew near, glances that slid away when he tried to catch them. He'd been magistrate long enough to recognize the signs of corruption creeping into what should have been straightforward legal proceedings. The territorial government was still finding its footing, and men like Jeremiah Oakes had learned to exploit the gaps in oversight. Clarence had been building a case against the auctioneer for months, documenting irregularities in estate sales and questionable ownership transfers, but he needed solid proof before he could act. "Next lot," called Oakes, his oily voice carrying over the assembled crowd. The man stood on a wooden platform that had been hastily constructed for the day's business, his fine clothes and gold watch chain marking him as someone who profited well from others' misfortunes. Fresh from back east, papers all in order. Young woman, good for domestic work or other arrangements as needed. Clarence's blood turned cold. He pushed through the crowd, his magistrate's badge catching the afternoon sunlight as he moved. There, on the platform beside Oakes, stood a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her dress, though clean, had been mended multiple times with careful stitches that spoke of pride despite poverty. But it was her eyes that made Clarence's chest tighten. They held the kind of fear he'd seen in cornered animals, the desperate awareness that their fate was entirely in the hands of others. The crowd pressed closer, men evaluating the woman like they might examine livestock. Clarence recognized several faces. Tom Barber, whose wife had died under suspicious circumstances the previous winter, Jake Morrison, who was known to work his hired hands near to death, and others whose reputations made Clarence's stomach turn at the thought of this young woman in their power. "What's the meaning of this, Oakes?" Clarence's voice cut through the murmur of interested bidders, carrying the authority that came with his position. The auctioneer's smile never wavered, though something predatory flickered behind his eyes. "Just conducting legal business, Magistrate Mitchell. Got all the proper documentation right here." He patted a leather satchel at his side with theatrical confidence. "Miss Minnie Wheeler, indentured servant contract, 7 years remaining. Previous employer deceased, estate needs to recover debts. All perfectly legitimate and above board." Clarence studied the woman more closely. Minnie Wheeler stood with her chin raised despite the trembling in her hands, a gesture of defiance that reminded him painfully of his sister Mary in her final days. Her gaze met his for just a moment, and he saw something that made his decision before his mind could catch up. A desperate plea that said everything her mouth couldn't, a silent cry for help that cut straight through his professional detachment. "I'll need to examine those papers," Clarence said, stepping onto the platform with the deliberate movements of a man asserting his legal authority. "Now see here," Oakes began, his jovial facade cracking slightly to reveal the calculating businessman beneath. "This is a legal proceeding, properly conducted, and I don't appreciate interference from." "The law requires all indentured contracts to be verified by the territorial magistrate," Clarence interrupted, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. The territorial statutes were still being written, and there were gray areas that men like Oakes had learned to exploit. "Miss Wheeler, do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" Minnie's voice came out barely above a whisper, but every word was clear and carried the weight of desperate truth. "Please don't send me back." The simple statement hit Clarence like a physical blow, transporting him instantly to another time, another auction yard, another young woman with terror in her eyes. He'd heard those exact words before, years ago, from his own sister before their father's debts had claimed her life and Clarence had been powerless to stop it. The memory of Mary's face, pale and frightened, superimposed itself over Minnie's features with painful clarity. $50, called a voice from the crowd. Clarence recognized Tom Barber's gravelly tone, and his hands clenched into fists at the thought of this vulnerable young woman in that man's isolated ranch house. 60, countered another man, and Clarence's stomach churned as he realized what kind of auction this truly was. These men weren't bidding for a domestic servant. They were purchasing a woman who would have no legal recourse, no protection, no way to refuse whatever demands they might make. The bidding continued, voices calling out amounts like they were haggling over cattle or farming equipment. Clarence watched Minnie's face grow paler with each new bid, saw the way her hands trembled as she realized her fate was being decided by whoever was willing to pay the most for her. 75, Clarence heard himself say, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd. Oakes's eyes narrowed with suspicion and calculation. Magistrate, surely you don't mean to participate in commercial proceedings that might compromise your official. $100, Clarence said firmly, cutting through the auctioneer's words with the finality of a judge's gavel. Final bid. The crowd fell silent, the magnitude of the sum settling over them like a heavy blanket. $100 was more than most men made in 3 months, more than many families saw in cash during an entire year. It was a statement of intent that brooked no argument, a definition that Clarence Mitchell was not participating in this auction lightly. Oakes's face had gone pale, and Clarence could see him calculating the implications of refusing a magistrate's bid. The man was corrupt, certainly, but he wasn't stupid. Challenging Clarence openly would invite scrutiny that his various schemes couldn't withstand. "Sold," Oakes said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "To Magistrate Mitchell for $100. Clarence stepped forward and helped Minnie down from the platform, his hand steady on her elbow as her legs nearly gave way beneath her. She was trembling openly now, and he could feel the fragility of her frame through the thin fabric of her dress. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the abrupt end to the entertainment, but Clarence could feel their curious stares following him and Minnie as they made their way toward his wagon. "Papers," he said to Oakes, extending his hand with the authority of his office. The auctioneer reluctantly handed over the leather satchel, his fingers lingering on the handles as if reluctant to let go of whatever power the documents represented. "You'll find everything in order, Magistrate. 7 years remaining on the contract, signed and witnessed properly according to territorial law." Clarence tucked the satchel under his arm without opening it, though every instinct told him the documents inside were fraudulent. He'd learned to trust those instincts during his years as magistrate, and they were screaming warnings about Oakes and his entire operation. "Miss Wheeler, if you'll come with me," he said gently, offering Minnie his arm. They walked through the crowd in silence, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments that followed in their wake. Clarence's wagon sat at the edge of the auction yard, his 2 horses pawing restlessly at the ground as if sensing the tension in the air. He helped Minnie onto the seat beside him with careful courtesy, then climbed up and took the reins with hands that were steadier than he felt. It wasn't until they were well clear of Millerville that Minnie spoke again, her voice still barely audible over the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the packed earth road. "Why?" she asked, and in that single word Clarence heard a universe of confusion, gratitude, and fear. Clarence considered the question as they rolled through the spring countryside, letting the peaceful rhythm of travel settle his thoughts. New grass was pushing up through the remnants of winter's brown stubble, and the air carried the promise of better days ahead. Meadowlarks called from fence posts, and in the distance he could see cattle grazing contentedly in pastures that would soon be thick with summer growth. Why, indeed? He could tell himself it was simple Christian duty, or legal obligation, or even just his natural instinct to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But looking at Minnie's profile as she watched the landscape roll by, her hands clasped tightly in her lap and her spine rigid with residual fear, he suspected the truth was more complicated than any of those explanations. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally, the words inadequate but honest. They rode in comfortable silence for another mile, the tension gradually leaving Minnie's posture as the auction yard fell further behind them. Clarence found himself stealing glances at his unexpected passenger, noting the careful way she held herself and the alertness in her eyes as she took in every detail of their surroundings. She had the bearing of someone who had learned to be constantly vigilant, to assess every situation for potential threats. "Where are you taking me?" Minnie asked eventually, her voice stronger now but still cautious. "My homestead. About 5 miles north of town." Clarence glanced at her sideways, trying to read her expression. "I've got a spare room, and plenty of work if you're inclined toward it." "But Minnie—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to understand something. I didn't buy you. I bought your contract, and as soon as I figure out how, I'm going to tear the damn thing up." Minnie turned to look at him fully for the first time, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope warring with the caution that experience had taught her. "You don't know me," she said. "I could be anyone. I could be trouble." Clarence smiled grimly, thinking of all the kinds of trouble that had crossed his path during his years as magistrate. "Miss Wheeler, I've been a magistrate for 3 years and a rancher for 10 before that. I've got a pretty good sense for people, and whatever trouble you might be, it's not the kind you made for yourself." The sincerity in his voice seemed to reach something deep inside Minnie, and for the first time since he'd seen her on that auction platform, her shoulders relaxed slightly. The Mitchell homestead sat in a valley between 2 low hills, protected from the worst of the winter winds but open to the morning sun that would nurture crops and warm the house during the coldest months. Clarence had built it himself over the course of 2 years after his wife's death, when he'd needed something to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied with concrete tasks instead of dwelling on loss and might-have-beens. The main house was solid timber and stone, built to last generations with wide porches that caught the breeze in summer and thick walls that held warmth in winter. A barn, chicken coop, and various outbuildings completed the picture of a working ranch, everything neat and well-maintained despite being the work of a single man. Clarence helped Minnie down from the wagon and led her toward the house, suddenly seeing his home through her eyes and feeling oddly nervous about her reaction. "It's not much," he said, though privately he was proud of what he'd accomplished with his own hands. "It's beautiful," Minnie said, and there was genuine wonder in her voice as she took in the carefully tended garden beds, the solid construction, and the sense of permanence that radiated from the well-built structures. Inside, the house was clean but sparse, bearing the unmistakable mark of a bachelor's existence. Clarence had never been one for decoration, and since Mary's death, he'd focused more on function than beauty. The main room contained a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space, a rough-hewn table and chairs that he'd made himself, and shelves lined with law books, farming manuals, and a few precious volumes of poetry that had been his wife's favorites. The kitchen was well-equipped but showed signs of meals prepared by a man who cooked for necessity rather than pleasure. "Your room's through here," Clarence said, leading Minnie down a short hallway lined with windows that let in the afternoon light. He opened a door to reveal a small but clean bedroom with a narrow bed covered by one of his wife's quilts, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a wooden chest that would hold her few possessions. "It was going to be—" He stopped himself, the old pain still sharp enough to steal his words. "Well, it's yours now for as long as you need it." Minnie set her small bundle of possessions on the bed with the careful movements of someone who had learned to make do with very little. She ran her hand over the quilt's intricate pattern, and Clarence saw tears gathering in her eyes at the simple kindness of being offered a room of her own. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, turning to face him with obvious effort, "I need to tell you something." "Clarence," he corrected gently. "And whatever it is, it can wait until you've had some rest and a proper meal. You look like you haven't eaten well in days." But Minnie shook her head with the determination of someone who had learned that delayed truths often became impossible truths. "No, you need to know. Those papers, the contract, it's not exactly what it seems." Clarence studied her face, noting the way her hands twisted together and the fear that had crept back into her eyes despite his reassurances. "What do you mean?" "I was never an indentured servant," Minnie said in a rush, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to get them out before her courage failed. "At least, not legally. My guardian. After my parents died, he took me in, treated me like family. But when he passed last winter, his debts, the men who came to settle the estate, they said I belonged to them now. They forged the papers, made it look legal. I tried to run, but they caught me and brought me here to sell me to whoever would pay." Clarence felt a cold rage building in his chest, the kind of controlled fury that had made him effective as both magistrate and rancher. "Who were these men?" "I don't know their real names. But one of them, he wore a badge. Deputy something. And the auctioneer, he knew them well. They planned to split the money from whoever bought me." Minnie's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They told me what would happen if I tried to tell anyone the truth." The pieces fell into place in Clarence's mind with sickening clarity. A corrupt deputy, a crooked auctioneer, and forged papers designed to give legal cover to what amounted to human trafficking. It was exactly the kind of scheme that had been plaguing the territory as more settlers arrived and law enforcement struggled to keep up with the demands of rapid growth and scattered communities. "Minnie," Clarence said carefully, his voice gentle despite the fury burning in his chest, "do you have family anywhere? Anyone who might be looking for you?" She shook her head with the finality of someone who had already explored every possibility. "No one. My parents died of fever 3 years ago, and my guardian had no other family. I'm completely alone in the world." Something in the way she said it, with such quiet acceptance of her solitary situation, made Clarence's chest tighten with recognition and sympathy. He'd been alone, too, these past years since Mary's death. Alone with his books and his duties and the endless cycle of seasons on a homestead built for a family he'd never had. "Well," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't quite ready to examine, "you're not alone now." That evening, Clarence sat at his kitchen table with the forged papers spread before him like evidence in a criminal trial. Even in the lamplight, the deception was obvious to his trained eye. The signatures were too perfect, too uniform to be genuine. The ink was too fresh for documents supposedly several years old, and there were water stains that had been artificially created to age the papers. The legal language was correct enough to fool most people, but there were subtle errors in terminology and format that marked it as the work of someone familiar with the law but not expert in its finer points. Minnie sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she watched him work. She'd eaten the simple supper of bread and beef stew he'd prepared with an appetite that suggested she hadn't had a proper meal in some time, and the color had begun to return to her cheeks in the warmth of the kitchen. "These are definitely forgeries," Clarence said, setting down his magnifying glass and leaning back in his chair. "Crude ones, at that. The question is what to do about it." "Can't you just destroy them?" Minnie asked hopefully. "I could, but that won't stop Oakes from coming after you or trying this scheme on someone else. There might be other victims we don't know about." Clarence gathered the papers into a neat stack. "We need to expose the whole operation, document everything, and present it to the territorial authorities." Minnie's face went pale at the implications. "They'll kill me if they think I'm going to testify against them." Clarence reached across the table and covered her hand with his, feeling the tremor that ran through her at his words. "Minnie, I give you my word as a magistrate and as a man. No one is going to hurt you while you're under my protection." She looked down at their joined hands, and Clarence was struck by how small and delicate hers looked compared to his work-roughened ones, how perfectly they seemed to fit together despite the vast differences in their situations. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, echoing her earlier question, but with deeper meaning now. "You don't even know me." Clarence was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer while the lamplight flickered over the papers that represented so much pain and corruption. The truth was complicated, bound up in memories of his sister and his own failures, his loneliness and his need to matter in a world that often seemed determined to crush the innocent. "I had a sister once," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mary. Our father got into debt after a bad harvest, and when he couldn't pay, they took her instead. Said she'd work it off in the city, that it was all legal and proper. I never saw her again." Minnie's fingers tightened around his, offering comfort for pain that was years old but still sharp. "I'm sorry. I was young then, barely 18 and powerless to stop it. But I'm not powerless now." Clarence met her eyes, letting her see the determination that had driven him through years of building a life that could protect people like his sister had been. "And maybe that's reason enough." Outside, the spring wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of rain that would nourish the newly planted fields. Clarence stood and moved to secure the shutters, his movements automatic after years of frontier living. As he worked, he was acutely aware of Minnie's presence in his kitchen, the first time in 3 years that his home had felt truly occupied by another human being's warmth and conversation. "Clarence." Minnie's voice was soft, uncertain. "Yes. Thank you. For everything. For buying my freedom, for offering me a home, for believing me about the papers." He paused in his work, touched by the simple gratitude in her voice but also by something deeper. The recognition that she saw his actions not as the duty of an official but as the choice of a man who cared about her welfare. "You don't need to thank me, Minnie. This is what neighbors do out here. What decent people do for each other." "Is that what we are? Neighbors?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to explore, but both were beginning to feel. Clarence turned back to the shutters, buying himself time to think about the implications of having Minnie Wheeler in his house, in his life, for more than just the few days it might take to resolve her legal situation. "I reckon we'll figure that out as we go along," he said finally, the words carrying more hope than he'd felt in years. The first real test of their arrangement came 3 days later when Reverend Thomas Jones rode up to the Mitchell homestead just as Clarence was returning from checking fence lines in the north pasture. The Reverend was a thin, earnest man with graying hair and the kind of stern expression that could make grown men confess to sins they hadn't even considered committing. His horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting he'd ridden hard from town with something pressing on his mind. Clarence dismounted and tethered his horse to the hitching post, nodding to the Reverend with the wariness of a man who sensed trouble approaching. "Afternoon, Thomas. What brings you out this way? I think you know, Clarence." Jones's voice carried the weight of moral authority backed by years of leading the community's spiritual guidance. "The whole town's talking about your acquisition at the auction." Through the kitchen window, Clarence could see Minnie preparing their evening meal. She moved with quiet efficiency, her dark hair catching the lamplight as she worked over the stove with a kind of practiced grace that spoke of years spent in domestic labor. The sight of her there, making his house into something that felt like a home for the first time in years, stirred something in his chest that he was still learning to name and understand. "My business is my own," Clarence said evenly, though he could feel his jaw tightening with the familiar frustration of having to defend actions he knew were right. "Not when it involves a young unmarried woman living under your roof without benefit of proper arrangement." Jones dismounted and fixed Clarence with his most penetrating stare, the one he usually reserved for Sunday sermons about moral failings. "The community has standards, Clarence. Christian standards that must be upheld if we're to maintain the kind of civilization we're trying to build out here." Clarence felt his temper beginning to rise, but he kept his voice level. "And Christian charity? What about that standard, Thomas?" "Christian charity doesn't require compromising a woman's reputation or your own." Jones glanced toward the house where Minnie's silhouette was visible through the window. I've come to offer a solution. The widow Morrison is looking for help with her boarding house. The young lady could work there, live there properly chaperoned, earn an honest wage without creating scandal. Have you asked Minnie what she wants? A woman in her position can hardly be expected to make such decisions for herself, Jones said with the certainty of a man who had never questioned the established order. She needs guidance from those better equipped to understand the moral implications of her situation. Clarence took a deep breath, reminding himself that Jones meant well despite his narrow view of proper behavior. The Reverend was a good man in many ways, genuinely concerned about the welfare of his flock, but he had never learned to see beyond the rigid conventions that governed frontier society. Thomas, that woman was being sold like cattle 3 days ago. She's safe here, she's treated with respect, and she's free to make her own choices about her future. I won't have her shipped off to satisfy gossips who have nothing better to do than speculate about other people's business. Jones's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. I understand your compassion, Clarence, but you must consider how this appears. An unmarried woman, a magistrate, living under the same roof without proper supervision. It undermines your authority in the community. Before Clarence could respond, the kitchen door opened and Minnie stepped onto the porch. She'd removed her apron and smoothed her hair, presenting herself with the quiet dignity that Clarence had come to admire. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation, forcing both men to acknowledge that they were discussing a real person rather than an abstract moral problem. "Good evening, Reverend," Minnie said with a slight curtsy that spoke of proper upbringing despite her current circumstances. "Miss Wheeler." Jones removed his hat with automatic courtesy. "I trust you're being treated well?" "Mr. Mitchell has been nothing but kind and respectful," Minnie said firmly. "I have my own room, my own space, and complete freedom to come and go as I please." "That's commendable, certainly. But surely you can see the delicate nature of your situation? The potential for misunderstanding." Minnie's spine straightened, and Clarence saw a flash of the steel that had enabled her to survive whatever hardships had brought her to that auction platform. "Reverend, with respect, I've lived through enough genuine threats to my safety and virtue to recognize the difference between real danger and social convention. Mr. Mitchell has asked nothing of me except honest work in exchange for shelter and protection." "Nevertheless," Jones pressed, "there are appearances to consider, expectations that—" "Whose expectations?" Clarence interrupted. "Who exactly is so concerned about Minnie's living arrangements that you felt the need to ride out here and disturb our peace?" The Reverend shifted uncomfortably, and Clarence caught the flash of guilt that crossed his features. "Mrs. Barber mentioned her concerns to several ladies after church, and Mr. Oakes stopped by this morning to inquire about your purchase." Clarence felt ice form in his veins. Oakes was asking about Minnie? "He seemed quite interested in her welfare," Jones said, missing the dangerous edge that had crept into Clarence's voice. "Said he wanted to ensure the transaction had been properly completed, all legal requirements met." Minnie's face went pale, and she moved instinctively closer to Clarence. "What did you tell him?" "Only that she was living here respectably, that there were no concerns about her treatment." Jones looked between them, finally beginning to sense the undercurrents of fear and anger that his words had stirred. "Is there something I should know about Mr. Oakes's interest?" Clarence exchanged a meaningful glance with Minnie. They had agreed to be cautious about who they shared their suspicions with until they had built a stronger case, but Oakes's inquiries suggested that their time for quiet investigation might be running out. "Thomas," Clarence said carefully, "I need you to understand something, and I need your word that it won't go beyond this conversation." The Reverend nodded slowly, his pastoral instincts recognizing the gravity in Clarence's tone. Minnie was never legally an indentured servant. The papers Oakes used to auction her were forgeries, part of what appears to be a scheme to traffic vulnerable women under the guise of legal debt collection. Jones's face went through a series of expressions, disbelief, shock, and finally righteous anger. "Are you certain of this? I've examined the documents. They're crude forgeries, but convincing enough to fool someone without legal training." Clarence moved closer to Minnie, his protective instincts fully engaged. If Oakes is asking questions, it means he's either worried about exposure or planning something else. This is an abomination," Jones said, his voice thick with horror at the implications. "To use the machinery of law and commerce for such evil purposes. What can be done?" "I'm building a case to present to the territorial authorities, but it will take time and careful documentation. In the meantime, Minnie needs to stay somewhere safe." "Then she must remain here," Jones said without hesitation. His moral calculus suddenly and completely reversed. "Whatever concerns I had about propriety pale beside the need to protect her from such wickedness. I'll speak to Mrs. Barber and the other ladies, explain that there are circumstances they don't understand." "You can't tell them the truth," Minnie said quickly. "If word gets back to Oakes—" "I'll handle it carefully," Jones assured her. "Trust me to find the right words to quiet gossip without revealing dangerous truths." After the Reverend departed with promises to watch for any unusual activity in town, Clarence and Minnie sat on the porch in the gathering dusk. The spring evening was mild, filled with the sounds of awakening life as winter finally released its grip on the land. Frogs called from the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Clarence's property, and somewhere in the distance a nighthawk cried as it began its evening hunt. "I'm sorry," Minnie said quietly. "I've brought trouble to your door, damaged your reputation in the community." Clarence reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past few days. "Minnie, my reputation will survive whatever gossip the town produces. What matters is keeping you safe and exposing the men who did this to you." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers intertwined with his as she watched fireflies begin their nightly dance in the meadow beyond the house. "I keep thinking about other women. If they're doing this to me, how many others have they sold? How many are trapped somewhere, believing they have no choice but to submit?" It was a thought that had been haunting Clarence as well. The casual efficiency with which Oakes had conducted the auction suggested this wasn't his first such transaction. Somewhere in the territory there might be other women like Minnie, isolated and helpless, their freedom stolen by men who had learned to disguise human trafficking as legal commerce. "We'll find them," Clarence promised. "Once we have enough evidence to move against Oakes and his associates, we'll demand a full accounting of their activities." "And if we can't prove anything? If they're too clever, too careful?" Clarence turned to look at her, seeing the worry that lined her features and the strength that kept her focused on others even while her own situation remained precarious. "Then we'll find another way. Sometimes justice has to be more creative than the law allows." Minnie studied his face in the fading light, reading something there that made her nod slowly. "You'd do that? Risk everything you've built here? For you? For the other women they might hurt?" Clarence's voice was steady, certain. "Yes." The simple diminution hung between them, weighted with implications that neither was quite ready to examine fully. But Minnie squeezed his hand, and Clarence felt something shift in the space between them, a deepening of trust and connection that went beyond the practical necessities of her protection. The next morning brought a more immediate challenge when Clarence discovered that someone had been on his property during the night. The evidence was subtle: a gate left unlatched, horse tracks near the barn that didn't match any of his animals, the sense that someone had been watching the house from the cover of the tree-line to the north. Minnie noticed his tension immediately when he returned from his morning inspection of the property. "What is it?" "We had visitors last night. Someone was scouting the place, probably checking our routines, seeing how well defended we are." Minnie set down the eggs she'd been gathering, her face going pale. "They're coming for me. Maybe. Or maybe they're just trying to intimidate us, make us nervous enough to make mistakes." Clarence checked the loads in his rifle, a gesture that was becoming unfortunately routine. Either way, we need to be more careful. No more working alone outside, no more predictable schedules. They spent the day preparing for trouble, checking weapons, securing the house, and establishing signals they could use to communicate danger. Clarence showed Minnie how to load and fire his spare rifle, discovering that she had some familiarity with firearms from her time with her guardian. "He taught me to hunt rabbits and birds," she explained as she demonstrated proper form with the weapon. Said a woman on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself and contribute to the family's food supply. Clarence nodded approvingly. He was a wise man. "What else did he teach you?" "Reading and writing, basic arithmetic. How to preserve food, tend wounds, deliver babies if needed. He said education was the only thing no one could take away from you." Minnie's voice carried a mixture of gratitude and grief for the man who had tried to prepare her for an uncertain world. "He was right about that. And about you needing to protect yourself." Clarence adjusted her stance slightly, helping her find better balance with the rifle. "But you won't be alone in this. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." That afternoon, as they worked together to reinforce the barn door that had been left suspiciously ajar, Clarence found himself studying Minnie's profile as she concentrated on the task at hand. She worked with the focused efficiency he'd come to admire, her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back practically. There was something deeply satisfying about sharing labor with someone who understood the value of honest work, who didn't need to be told what needed doing or how to do it properly. "Clarence." Minnie's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Yes. After this is over, after we've dealt with Oakes and the others, what then?" It was a question he'd been avoiding, though it had been lurking at the edges of his thoughts for days. What would happen when Minnie was truly free, when she no longer needed his protection and could choose her own path without fear? "I suppose that depends on what you want," he said carefully. Minnie set down her hammer and turned to face him fully. "I've been thinking about that. For the first time in my life, I'm thinking about what I actually want instead of just trying to survive whatever situation I've been placed in." "And what do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from his face to the valley that surrounded his homestead, taking in the peaceful beauty of the land he'd claimed and improved with his own hands. "I want to stay," she said finally. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I need protection, but because this feels like home." "You feel like home." Clarence felt his breath catch in his chest. He'd been hoping for exactly those words while simultaneously trying to convince himself not to expect them. Minnie was young, beautiful, and deserving of choices that weren't constrained by gratitude or necessity. "Minnie, I need you to be sure about this. You've been through a terrible ordeal, and sometimes when someone saves us, we can confuse gratitude with—" She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Do you think I don't know my own heart? That I'm some helpless girl who can't tell the difference between rescue and love?" The word hung between them, finally spoken aloud after days of careful dancing around the truth they both felt. "Love," Clarence repeated quietly. "Yes, love." Minnie's voice was steady, certain. "I love the way you treat me like an equal, the way you ask for my opinion and listen to my answers. I love working beside you, sharing meals with you, feeling like I'm building something worthwhile instead of just surviving from day to day. I love—" Clarence silenced her with a kiss, gentle but firm, his hands coming up to frame her face as he finally gave in to the feelings he'd been fighting since the moment he'd seen her on that auction platform. Minnie melted into him, her arms sliding around his neck as she returned the kiss with a passion that spoke of genuine feeling rather than mere gratitude. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Clarence rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he admitted. "I've been trying not to, trying to do the right thing and not take advantage of your situation. But Minnie, I've been half in love with you since the moment you asked me not to send you back." "Then don't," she whispered. "Don't send me back. Don't send me away. Let me stay and build a life here with you." "It won't be easy," Clarence warned, though his arms tightened around her. "We'll face questions, judgment, people who think they know what's best for both of us." "We'll face them together," Minnie said firmly. "The way we're going to face Oakes and whatever he's planning." Clarence nodded, sealing their agreement with another kiss that promised partnership in all the challenges to come. But even as he held Minnie close, he couldn't shake the feeling that those challenges were approaching faster than either of them was prepared for. That evening, as they shared a quiet dinner and planned their strategy for gathering more evidence against Oakes's operation, neither noticed the figure watching them from the shadows at the edge of the property. Deputy Marcus Webb had been paid well to keep track of the magistrate's activities, and what he saw through the lit windows of the Mitchell homestead confirmed his employer's worst fears. The woman was talking freely with Mitchell, clearly comfortable and unafraid. Whatever hold Oakes had hoped to maintain over her through fear and isolation was slipping away. Something would have to be done, and soon, before she convinced the magistrate to dig too deeply into business that was better left alone. Webb melted back into the darkness, his mind already working through the plans that Oakes had prepared for exactly this contingency. By tomorrow night, the magistrate's interference would be permanently resolved, and the woman would learn what happened to those who caused inconvenience for their betters. As he rode back toward town, Webb allowed himself a satisfied smile. The law was a useful tool when wielded by those who understood how to bend it to their purposes, and by this time tomorrow, Clarence Mitchell would discover just how powerless a single man could be against a system designed to serve those with the money and connections to make it work in their favor. The attack came just before dawn on a Tuesday morning when the mist still clung to the valley floor and the world was wrapped in that peculiar silence that comes in the hour before sunrise. Clarence woke to the sound of his horses whinnying in distress, a sound that sent ice through his veins because it meant strangers were near his barn. He rolled out of bed, grabbed his rifle, and moved to the window in one fluid motion born of frontier instincts honed by years of living where threats could materialize without warning. Through the gray light, he could see 3 figures moving around his property with the purposeful efficiency of men carrying out a planned operation. One was attempting to open the barn door while another kept watch near the house. The third was circling toward the back, probably planning to cut off any escape route. Clarence recognized the tactics of men who had done this before, who understood how to isolate and control their targets with military precision. He moved quickly to Minnie's room, finding her already awake and alert, having heard the same sounds that had roused him. She was dressed and holding the spare rifle he'd given her, her face pale but determined in the dim light filtering through her window. The past weeks of preparation had transformed her from a frightened victim into someone ready to defend what they'd built together. 3 men, Clarence whispered. "Maybe more I can't see. They're trying to get to the horses first, probably planning to trap us here and force a surrender." Minnie nodded, her hands steady on the rifle despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "What do? "We make them think twice about this being easy prey," Clarence said grimly. "You stay here, cover the back of the house. Don't shoot unless you have a clear threat, but don't hesitate if it comes to that. These men won't show us any mercy." "Clarence," Minnie caught his arm as he turned to leave, her fingers gripping him with desperate strength. "Be careful. I can't lose you now, not when we've finally found each other." He leaned down and kissed her quickly, tasting fear and love and determination all mixed together on her lips. "You won't lose me. We're going to get through this and make them pay for thinking they could threaten what's ours." Clarence made his way through the house like a ghost, using every shadow and familiar creak to mask his movement. He'd built this home with his own hands, knew every board and beam, every hiding place and defensive position. Through the kitchen window, he could see the man near the barn more clearly now. Deputy Marcus Webb, still wearing his badge like a shield against consequences. The sight of that star pinned to the shirt of a man engaged in what amounted to kidnapping filled Clarence with a cold rage that settled into his bones like winter frost. Webb was working methodically to open the barn door, clearly intending to steal or scatter the horses that would be essential for any escape or pursuit. His movements were confident, practiced, suggesting this wasn't his first such raid. Clarence felt sick thinking about how many other homesteads might have been visited by these men, how many other women might have been dragged away in the pre-dawn darkness. He eased open the front door and slipped onto the porch, using the thick wooden posts for cover as he took aim. The distance was about 60 yards, well within his capabilities but requiring precision in the uncertain light of dawn. Clarence had learned marksmanship in the army before coming west, and the skills had served him well in his years as both rancher and magistrate. He steadied his breathing, found his target, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth motion of a man who understood that hesitation could mean death. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and Webb spun around with a cry of pain as the bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling into the dirt near the barn. The other two men immediately took cover, but their positions were now revealed, and Clarence had the advantage of knowing his own property better than they did. "This is Magistrate Mitchell," Clarence called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office and the promise of violence from a man defending his home. "You're trespassing on private property and threatening a citizen under my protection. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences under territorial law." "We got legal authority," one of the men shouted back, though he stayed safely behind the water trough he'd chosen for cover. Clarence could see the man's hat and the barrel of his rifle, but not enough of him to risk a shot. "That woman's a fugitive from justice, and we're here to collect her according to proper warrant." Clarence almost laughed at the absurdity of it, the brazen lie delivered with such conviction. What justice? The kind that involves forged papers and corrupt auctions? I've got those documents, and I know exactly what they really are. Your authority is as fraudulent as your paperwork. The response was a rifle shot that splintered the porch post inches from Clarence's head, followed by the crash of breaking glass as someone put a bullet through his kitchen window. The talking was over, and Clarence felt the familiar calm that came over him in moments of mortal danger, the clarity that had kept him alive through years of frontier conflicts and territorial disputes. He moved to a better position, using the solid stone foundation of his house for protection as he returned fire. His second shot caught one of the attackers in the leg, dropping him with a scream that echoed off the hills and sent birds exploding from the nearby trees in startled flight. The wounded man's rifle went skittering across the ground, and his companion had to break cover to drag him to safety, giving Clarence another clear shot that he used to put a bullet through the man's hat. The remaining able-bodied attacker decided that discretion was the better part of valor and began retreating toward the tree line, dragging his wounded companion while trying to maintain covering fire. Clarence let them go, knowing that pursuit would leave Minnie undefended and that wounded men would be more likely to talk than dead ones. But Webb wasn't finished. Despite his wounded shoulder, the deputy had managed to circle around behind the barn and was now approaching the back of the house where Minnie waited. Clarence saw the movement just in time, catching a glimpse of the man's distinctive jacket as he moved through the shadows of the outbuildings. "Minnie! Behind you!" Clarence shouted, already running toward the back of the house. The sound of her rifle firing came almost immediately, a sharp snap that was followed by Webb's bellow of rage and pain. Clarence sprinted around the house to find the deputy on the ground, clutching his thigh where Minnie's shot had found its mark. She stood in the back doorway, the rifle still smoking in her hands, her face set with the grim satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended herself against a genuine threat. "Nice shot," Clarence said, covering Webb with his own weapon while he assessed the deputy's condition. The wound was serious but not life-threatening, which was exactly what Clarence needed for the interrogation that would follow. "He was trying to break down the back door," Minnie replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I gave him one warning, told him to stop and identify himself. When he raised his rifle toward me, I fired. Just like you taught me." Webb glared up at them with the impotent fury of a man whose careful plans had collapsed around him, his face pale with pain and shock. You got no idea what you're dealing with, Mitchell. This goes deeper than you think, involves people with more power than some frontier magistrate can handle. You've made enemies today that will destroy everything you care about. Then maybe it's time those people learned that frontier magistrates don't back down from bullies, Clarence said. He kept his rifle trained on Webb while he used the deputy's own handcuffs to secure him, checking the man's wounds to ensure he wouldn't bleed to death before they could get answers. Minnie, would you mind riding to town and fetching Doc Harrison? And stop by Reverend Jones's place. Tell him we need him as a witness for what's about to happen. What about the other men? Minnie asked, glancing toward the tree line where the remaining attackers had disappeared. Clarence considered the question while he dragged Webb toward the house, the deputy's groans of pain providing a satisfying counterpoint to his earlier threats. They'll be back, but not today. Today they'll be licking their wounds and reporting to whoever sent them that this job isn't going to be as easy as they thought. But we need to move quickly before they can regroup with reinforcements. While Minnie rode to town, Clarence locked Webb in his root cellar and began the methodical process of documenting everything that had happened. He sketched the positions where each man had taken cover, collected the spent cartridges from their weapons, and carefully photographed Webb's wounds and weapons using the camera equipment he'd acquired for official magistrate business. When this went to trial, he wanted every detail preserved and documented according to proper legal procedure, leaving no room for corrupt officials to dismiss the charges on technicalities. The root cellar was cool and dark, carved into the hillside behind his house and lined with stone to keep vegetables fresh through the winter. It made an excellent temporary jail, secure and uncomfortable enough to encourage cooperation. Clarence had left Webb with a lantern and a bucket of water, but no food and no blankets. The deputy would be motivated to talk sooner rather than later. Doc Harrison arrived first, a gruff man in his 60s who had seen enough frontier violence to take gunshot wounds in stride. He examined Webb with professional competence but no sympathy, muttering about lawmen who forgot which side of the law they were supposed to be on. "Bullet went clean through," Doc reported as he finished bandaging the deputy's thigh. "No major damage to bone or artery, but he'll be limping for months. Shoulders messy, eh? Bullet's still in there, but it can wait for proper surgical facilities if he cooperates. If he doesn't." Doc shrugged meaningfully. Reverend Jones arrived shortly after, bringing with him Mayor Thompson and 3 other prominent citizens who could serve as witnesses to whatever Webb might confess. Clarence had sent word through Minnie that this was bigger than a simple attack on his property, that the corruption they'd uncovered might extend throughout the territorial government and required the community's full attention. Thomas Barber, the banker, had come despite his wife's earlier gossip about Clarence's living arrangements. His presence was particularly valuable because he would have records of any unusual financial transactions that might support their case. Dr. Sarah Whitfield, one of the territory's few female physicians, had arrived with her medical bag and a stern expression that suggested she understood exactly what kinds of crimes they were investigating. With the witnesses assembled in his main room, Clarence brought Webb up from the cellar and placed him in a chair where everyone could see and hear him clearly. The deputy was pale from blood loss but still defiant, his eyes promising retribution for the humiliation he'd suffered. The fight had gone out of him somewhat, but Clarence could see that he was still calculating, still looking for an angle that might save him from the consequences of his actions. "Deputy Webb," Clarence began formally, his voice carrying the full weight of his magistrate's authority, "you're charged with trespassing, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, corruption of office, and violation of civil rights under territorial statute. Before we proceed further, I want to give you a chance to cooperate. Tell us who sent you, who's behind the forged papers, and what happened to the other women you've sold." Webb spat on Clarence's floor, the gesture defiant despite his precarious position. "Go to hell, Mitchell. You think your little territorial authority means anything against real power? You got no idea what forces you're playing with here. This goes all the way to the Capitol, involves people who can make you disappear without a trace." Clarence nodded to Reverend Jones, who stepped forward with a leather satchel that Clarence had prepared earlier. "Maybe this will change your mind." He opened the satchel and spread out a collection of documents on the table where Webb could see them clearly. "These are copies of forged indenture contracts, auction records with suspicious alterations, bank transfers showing money moving between your account and Oakes's, and correspondence between you and various buyers throughout the territory. We've been busy while you were planning your raid." Webb's face went white as he recognized the implications of the paperwork spread before him. Clarence had been building his case methodically over the past weeks, using his contacts in the territorial government and his own investigative skills to trace the network of corruption that had made Minnie's ordeal possible. The documents represented months of careful work, and they painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. "Where did you get those?" Webb's voice was barely a whisper, all his earlier bravado evaporating as he realized the extent of their knowledge. "Turns out Oakes isn't as careful as he thinks," Clarence said, though in truth much of their evidence had come from his own painstaking investigation rather than any cooperation from the auctioneer's associates. When you threaten the wrong person's family, sometimes they decide to cooperate with the law instead of continuing to enable corruption. Amazing how many people are willing to talk once they realize they're not going to be protected by their employers. It was a calculated bluff, designed to make Webb believe that his associates had already betrayed him and that cooperation was his only hope of avoiding the worst consequences. Clarence watched the deputy's face carefully, reading the fear and calculation that played across his features as he processed this information. Mayor Thompson leaned forward, his face grave with the implications of what he was hearing. The mayor was an honest man, genuinely shocked by the extent of the corruption they'd uncovered. "Webb, if even half of what's in these documents is true, you're looking at federal charges. Human trafficking, mail fraud, conspiracy across territorial lines, violation of civil rights. You could hang for this, and that's if you're lucky enough to make it to trial before some of your victims' families decide to take justice into their own hands." "But," Clarence added, his voice taking on the tone of a magistrate offering a deal, "if you cooperate fully, tell us everything about the operation and help us recover the other victims, the territorial court might be inclined toward leniency. Life in prison instead of a rope, perhaps even the possibility of parole after 20 years if you provide substantial assistance in prosecuting the others involved." Webb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from face to face as he calculated his chances and weighed his options. Clarence could see the moment when desperation overcame loyalty, when the deputy realized that his associates would gladly sacrifice him to save themselves. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat, and when he spoke, his voice was hollow with the knowledge of his own damnation. "There's 12 of them," he said quietly. 12 women sold in the last 18 months. Some local girls whose families were too poor or powerless to ask questions. Some brought in from back east under false pretenses about employment opportunities. Oakes's got buyers lined up from here to California, men willing to pay premium prices for women with no family to ask questions about their welfare. The room erupted in angry voices as the full scope of the crime became clear. Dr. Whitfield was on her feet, her face flushed with righteous anger. 12 women. Sold like cattle to men who... She couldn't finish the sentence, too overcome with fury at the implications. Clarence held up his hand for silence, his own rage carefully controlled as he focused on getting the information they needed to rescue the victims and build an airtight case against all those involved. "Where are they now?" "Scattered all over the territory and beyond. Oakes keeps records, likes to know where his merchandise ends up in case he needs to retrieve them for some reason or arrange additional services." Webb's voice was bitter with self-loathing as he spoke, but Clarence could see that the deputy was committed now to full cooperation. "Got a safe in his office behind a painting of his father. Combination is his birthday, March 15th, 1822. Everything's in there. Names, locations, prices paid, even photographs in some cases." Reverend Jones was already moving toward the door, his pastoral anger fully aroused by what he'd heard. I'll gather the men. We can be in town within the hour, surround Oakes's office before he knows what's happening." "Wait," Clarence called, his legal training overriding his desire for immediate action. "We do this legally, by the book. I want federal marshals involved, proper warrants, everything documented so thoroughly that no corrupt judge can dismiss the charges on technicalities. If we move too fast, we risk letting the real architects of this scheme escape justice." Mayor Thompson nodded approvingly, his own understanding of politics and law informing his response. "I'll send riders to the territorial capital immediately. This is exactly the kind of case that will get federal attention, especially with an election coming up and politicians looking to appear tough on crime." Dr. Whitfield had been examining the documents while the men talked, her medical training helping her understand the systematic nature of the abuse described in the records. "Clarence, we need to start planning for the recovery process. These women will need medical attention, counseling, safe places to stay while they rebuild their lives. The trauma from what they've endured." "You're right," Clarence agreed, grateful for her practical perspective on the human cost of what they'd uncovered. "Minnie and I have discussed converting part of our property into a safe haven, at least temporarily. We've got the space, and Minnie understands better than anyone what these women will be going through." As the others dispersed to set the legal machinery in motion and begin the complex process of organizing a rescue operation, Clarence found himself alone with Minnie on his front porch, watching the sun rise over the valley that had become their battleground. The attack had left its marks, bullet holes in his house, blood on his property, and the sobering knowledge that their fight was far from over. 12 women, Minnie said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of shared trauma and survivor's guilt. 12 lives stolen and sold like cattle, while I was lucky enough to be bought by the one decent man in that crowd. Clarence took her hand, drawing strength from her presence beside him while offering his own steady support. "You weren't lucky, Minnie. You were strong enough to recognize help when it came and brave enough to trust someone who could have been just another threat. That strength is what saved you, and it's what's going to help us save the others." "And after that?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the peaceful valley wake up around them. "After we've found them all and brought justice to their tormentors?" Clarence turned to look at her, seeing not the frightened woman from the auction platform but the strong, determined partner who had stood beside him through violence and uncertainty, who had faced armed men and made the hard choices that survival required. "After that, we build the life we talked about. We get married, properly and legally, and we show this territory what decent people can accomplish when they stand together against corruption and evil." Minnie smiled, the first truly happy expression he'd seen from her since the day they'd met, a smile that spoke of hope and trust and the kind of deep contentment that comes from finding your place in the world. "Is that a proposal, Magistrate Mitchell?" "I reckon it is, Miss Wheeler. Though I'm afraid I can't offer you a quiet, peaceful life. Seems like I've got a talent for attracting trouble and making enemies of powerful people." "Good thing I've got a talent for facing trouble and standing up to powerful people," Minnie replied, reaching up to kiss him as the sun finally crested the hills and flooded their valley with golden light that promised better days ahead. The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough, aided by Webb's cooperation and the meticulous documentation that Clarence had prepared. Within 2 weeks, federal marshals had arrested Oakes, 3 other corrupt officials, and a network of buyers who had participated in the trafficking scheme. All 12 women were located and freed, though some bore scars that would take years to heal. 6 months later, Clarence stood on the courthouse steps in Millerville, watching as federal marshals led Jeremiah Oakes and his remaining associates away in chains. The trial had been swift and decisive, with Webb's testimony and the recovered documents providing overwhelming evidence of the trafficking ring's scope and methods. The sentences had been harsh. Oakes received life in prison, Webb got 20 years with possibility of parole, and the buyers faced terms ranging from 5 to 15 years depending on their level of involvement. Minnie stood beside him, wearing the simple blue dress they'd been married in the month before, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly that announced the new life they were building together. The wedding had been small but joyful, with Reverend Jones officiating and the entire town turning out to celebrate the union of two people who had found love in the midst of darkness and had used that love to bring justice to their community. "It's over," Minnie said, watching the prison wagon disappear down the dusty main street, taking with it the last of the men who had terrorized innocent women for profit. "This part is," Clarence agreed, his arm tightening around her as he spoke. "But there's still work to do. Other corrupt officials to investigate, other victims to help, laws to strengthen so this doesn't happen again. Evil like this doesn't disappear just because we've defeated one group of criminals." Minnie smiled and squeezed his hand, her touch conveying all the partnership and shared purpose that had grown between them. "Then it's good we're in this together. Always." As they walked home through the autumn afternoon, past fields heavy with harvest and trees beginning to turn gold with the promise of winter, Clarence reflected on the strange turns that life could take. A year ago, he'd been a lonely widower, focused on duty and justice but lacking the personal connections that gave meaning to both. Now he had a wife he loved deeply, a child on the way, and the satisfaction of knowing that their struggle had made a real difference in the world. The homestead looked different now, expanded with a new room for the baby and softened with Minnie's touches throughout. There were flowers in the windows, quilts on the beds, and the sound of laughter that echoed through rooms that had been silent too long. It was, Clarence thought, exactly what a home should be, a place where love was nurtured, justice was valued, and the future was faced with courage and hope, no matter what challenges that future might bring.